Hey everybody, Michael LeJeune here with Game Changers for Government Contractors, and we're going to be talking about a topic I don't think we've ever covered on this show, and I know very little about, which is very odd for me, Bryon. So I'm looking forward to that and just kind of picking your brain about this. But before we get into our topic today, why don't you take a minute to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Um, I'm Bryon Kroger, founder and CEO of Rise 8. Prior to this, I did 10 years active duty Air Force. I was actually an intelligence officer, and for the first 7 years, I did mostly targeting operations. As we'll get to, we'll talk about software. I used really terrible software for those 7 years.
Yeah,
I was surprised coming into it. I thought that I was going to, use some of the coolest software on the planet, doing some of the
yeah,
coolest missions on the planet, and my software was usually working against me rather than for me. So for my last 3 years, I actually cross-trained into federal acquisitions and helped fix some of the software that I had been using.
nice.
And that led me to wanting to get out and start Rise 8 to help from the industry side.
Nice, nice. I was an Army Intel guy and kind of had the same crossover as well. A lot of the software wasn't working well and made the transition from that over into the commercial or the government side and, worked on making that software better as well. So it's an interesting background there, but from the Army side. So, yeah, it's a lot of fun. Today we're going to be talking about a continuous authority to operate. And this is a topic I don't know a whole lot about, just haven't had to deal with it in my career a whole lot. So, could you briefly explain to folks what is a continuous authority to operate and how it differs from the traditional just ATO?
Absolutely. So I think in today's modern world, you have to be able to ship software continuously, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the differentiator on the battlefield, it's not going to be the software that we go to war with. That's irrelevant. It won't survive first contact with the enemy, just like plans. It's going to be our ability to sense and respond to the enemy with software, right? So
Mm-hmm.
continuous updates, whether, we saw this in Ukraine with jamming, for instance, right? Russians were jamming Starlink. Starlink was able to ship a software update to overcome that jamming, on the spot within hours. We're going to need to be able to do that all throughout a modern conflict. And so for me, the ability to continuously deliver software means that I need to be able to have a continuous authority to operate. So you have your normal ATOs. Usually you get an ATO. Most of them will last for about 3 years. You can make minor updates to your software, but a major update is going to trigger a major revision, right? And going through that ATO process again. So how do we make the ATO process concurrent with a modern DevOps software development lifecycle? That's the putting aside all the NIST language and all of the policy and everything else. That's the simple way to look at it, is how do we align our GRC process to our modern software development lifecycle?
Yeah,
That's
and
what
I think,
continuous AT
yeah,
is.
that's good. Good insight there. When I was doing software back in the day, we would have versions of the software. So, like when we released version 2.0, that had to go through the whole ATO process. But when we did 2.1 and 2.4 and 2.5, it really didn't because there was minor updates, and we had to get with our developers all the time and say, look, if you're not making a major change, let's do a point difference. So it's like 2.6 or 2.7 or whatever. But if you're going to jump to 3.0, that's going to cause problems. We may not be able to deploy this thing everywhere. And so I see your point there and how this is really beneficial. So I kind of stolen a little bit of the thunder out of the first question I had for you is like, what are some of the key advantages of having this continuous authority for government contractors compared to the regular process? And again, talked about a little bit of them there, but maybe you have some expansion on that.
Yeah. So, to be able to achieve that continuous software delivery, you need the continuous ADO. To be able to get that, you need continuous RMF. That's the risk management framework, right? That's what everybody follows, at least in the DoD and at most federal agencies in order to get an ATO. The advantages here are there's a few. Like one you just mentioned is actually becomes problematic because people start gaming the system to avoid triggering large batches and
Mm-hmm.
large reviews. And that can actually create security vulnerabilities, which is a whole nother problem on the battlefield. Um, I think that the ability to actually offer more transparency and more insight to
Mm.
assessors and auditors is an advantage. So the obvious advantages are the capability providers and to the capability users. Those are obvious. We're getting continuous software updates. That's good for developers. It's good for users. But I think what's often overlooked in this is that we're not then asking auditors and assessors and assessor representatives to, quote, take more risk or to
Mm.
have less access to information or anything. We can give them more. And so one of the things we focus on when we're doing this is, how do I actually give assessors more insight than they've ever had, more transparency, more access, more control than they've actually ever had? And so the advantages are that not only do you get a more performant system for users and a better experience for program developers, but you actually get better security and better
Mm.
compliance outcomes.
Mm. Well, what are some steps that I can take if I'm a government contractor and I'm in this position and I'm frustrated with the normal ATO process? What are some steps that I can take on my side to transition to this model?
The first one is how you architect your system. So really need to pay attention to architecting for maximum controlled inheritance, right? So in a modern tech stack, most people are deploying their software to either the cloud or an on-premise cloud type environment. And the more opinionated we can make that stack, the more controls that we can inherit. So I want to use a really opinionated cloud platform. And there's work involved to create that platform, or you could buy a COTS solution. But in doing that, now every app that deploys on top of that gets to inherit all of the security controls from it. And
Mm.
so if you have 100 teams, or, if you look at enterprise wide, like Army, Air Force, Navy, they have thousands of developers who are all re-accomplishing security controls at low levels in the tech stack, right? I mean, one of the controls I always joke about is there a water shutoff valve within 50 feet of your server? Like, what software developer
Yeah.
knows that, especially a modern software developer, right? Is there a lock on the server room? Just like these silly things. So let's abstract that all away from developers, both from a development perspective, like they don't have to worry about developing their own infrastructure, so they can focus on feature development, but also now they don't have to worry about all the GRC that goes along with that and spending their sprint cycles focused on answering GRC questions. Instead, they can just focus on features and answer security controls just for those features.
Yeah.
So that maximizing your control inheritance is a big one. And sometimes you might have control over that. So like if you own a large program, you may say like, hey, let's architect this stack. Again, it doesn't have to be in the cloud. It could be on premise, but we're going to do a lot of not only infrastructure, but what you might have called middleware in in modern parlance, that would be platform is the new buzzword that everybody's using,
Mm-hmm.
and make that as opinionated as possible and answer as much security controls as we can. And then the second one that I would offer up that's really easy is advocating to your program to actually hire dedicated technical assessors for your work. Now, this is a little bit hard from a business perspective, but we actually tell our folks like, hey, fence off some of your program funds. Instead of paying for 2 extra software developers at Rise 8, pay for 2 technical assessors that are independent from us and work for your authorizing official. And even though that's taking 2 devs away from us, the speed that it gets us is worth way more than 2 devs, right? And so
Mm.
it actually not only ends up creating more feature velocity, it leads to better security outcomes as well.
Mm. So couple things. One, you mentioned GRC a few times. For the folks that are listening that don't know what that is, explain that to folks.
Yes, governance, risk, and compliance.
Yep.
So
Just so folks know. And then you talked about infrastructure a bit. So what kind of infrastructure or tools do you find are necessary for an organization to implement this?
the more you can move towards a modern cloud native architecture, the better off you're going to be. But this could be done with virtual machines too.
Hmm.
I think that the more you can get really tight declarative configuration management, the better off you're going to be. So one of the common problems with VMs, virtual machines, that you'll see is configuration drift, right? And as soon as you have configuration drift, then assessors really they hone in on that, and they start figuring out what are your manual processes to ensure that you don't have configuration drift. Where's your configuration control board? And they put a bunch of government processes on top of it. Whereas in a modern cloud architecture, I can do infrastructure as code, where I can hold the configuration in source control, and I can always have the version that's in my source running in production, and I can verify that's the case. I can actually script a test against my infrastructure as code to verify the control that I put in place is in place in production. So the more you can move to that, the more automation you're going to have, the less manual review you're going to have, the faster you're going to go. But
Yeah.
you can do a lot of what I'm talking about with virtual machines too. And there's a lot of kind of hybrid type cloud environments where we can put a lot of configuration as code, even for virtual machines, into place. And there's now ways to run virtual machines on cloud infrastructure. You start getting hairy there, depending on what kind of system performance you're looking for. But there are ways to really manage that configuration control. And I think that's a really big one.
Yeah, that's really good. What do you see as some of the common challenges when somebody's, facing this approval, and how would they overcome those?
Yeah, the technical implementation is actually not that hard, especially for anybody that is familiar with cloud native software development. I think one thing, I mentioned that I moved over to federal acquisition regulations. The program that I helped co-found was Air Force Kessel Run project, which a lot of folks might be familiar with. And the aspect that was difficult to implement was actually the kind of change management, the culture, the psychology. And the whole time we were doing Kessel Run, we were doing what I called bureaucracy hacker. I said, I don't care what your job title is. If you're a designer, a software engineer, a product manager, leadership of any kind, middle management, first and foremost, you have to be a bureaucracy hacker if you want to be part of our organization. And I think to be a really effective bureaucracy hacker, just like any hacking, you can't hack a system that you don't understand. And so the really important thing here is to go deep on the ATO processes, the local processes, and the governance for it, which would be found in NIST RMF, the risk management framework. And so knowing and understanding that really well, and then instead of what I see a lot of people do, they fall into this trap. The whole innovation ecosystem does this. Oh, these people, they're just backwards. They're behind the times. They don't understand technology. They'll go talk to them like, oh, well, if you understood Kubernetes, you would know that this is secure, and they're almost attacking the people they're trying to get to approve systems. And also they aren't able to meet the actual policy and in some cases law here, right? I mean, RMF is an outcropping of law. And so they can't create the change management that they need. And so instead it's figuring out, how can I 100% meet not just the intent, but the letter of NIST RMF and still go fast? And we've proven, and not just us, but several government organizations now have done this. They've proven that you can go fast at DevOps speeds and still be RMF compliant. And so that's the biggest thing to focus on, is going deep on NIST RMF and figuring out, how do I align the RMF with the DevOps lifecycle?
Yeah. I can see the challenges there, especially when you're somewhat biting the hand that feeds you, as you kind of described there, which I've never really understood why people do that. But how, given the challenges that you see, how should a contractor prepare for all of this?
Definitely, the earlier you can catch it, the better. If you're already on contract, you might have some limitations, because I would say you need dedicated personnel to focus on this automation, right? Because the government's not going to have the resources to do that part for you. And so for us, just as an example, like on a modern like app development project where it's cloud-based app development and we're trying to get a continuous ATO, typically we would have a small policy team that's helping have those conversations with more traditional governance, risk, and compliance folks about, hey, this isn't that scary. We're going to take you along for the journey. We're here to help you. We're going to make your lives better. We're going to give you more access. You don't need to take more risk. We'll actually make it less risky. This is less risky than the way that you're doing business. That's usually like a 2, for a large program, maybe like 4-person team that's just focused on helping get through a lot of the compliance, especially early on. Later on, we might be able to reduce that team once the government's good to go on their end. And then the automation team is usually like a 6 to 8-person automation team. That's fairly substantial. If you're on a program with like 20 FTEs, adding 6, you don't want to do that out of hide. So this is a conversation you would want to have with the government during the business development stage, ideally before, RFP or even draft RFP, or like shaping this of, hey, I know you want to build apps. We not only want to build apps, we want to actually deliver them and continuously with you so that your warfighters get the capabilities they need. You need to consider continuous ATO, and like, here's how we would shape that. So that's the automation team. And then the other side is the architecture that I talked about. So that doesn't really drive a change in FTEs per se, but as you know, architecture decisions are hard to reverse. And so you want to be having those conversations as early in the process as you can to make sure you don't architect yourself into a corner where it's really difficult to achieve that level of configuration management that I talked about, as well as the security controls that you can inherit as an application team.
Yeah. I mean, you've kind of been sprinkling this through the whole thing. Are there some additional, what you would consider maybe best practices that people need to follow in order to maintain this continuous authority?
Yes, there definitely are. I would say, and we actually published our playbook, like our internal playbook. We just published it because I felt like continuous ATO was starting to become kind of an insider's game. And for me, I think everybody needs to start doing this. Or like, we talk about disruption in the Fortune 500, and like, oh, half the Fortune 500 has been disrupted in the last 20 years since Mark Andreessen said software is eating the world. Great. Some people lost some profits. If we get disrupted on the battlefield, like, people die and we might lose our way of life.
Right.
So for me, I want to get everybody doing this. So you can actually go to our website and find our CATO playbook. And it's literally the one that we use internally. It's got all the tips and tricks. I would say, though, on the maintaining it piece, two things that are really difficult is, this is common with traditional ATOs too, but I think even though there shouldn't be a double standard, once you move to this model, you automatically get higher scrutiny. Is people get their initial ATO and then it doesn't get looked at as closely after that because you're moving on to the next app and the next app. And so making sure you have a good process in place to revisit. So that could be random spot checks, a really great way. Quarterly pen testing, where you're pen testing against the whole system. And then figuring out automated ways, especially, as you move teams to more of an automated controls tracking. Normally when you get an ATO, there are findings. There's never like a perfect, like, hey, we had no findings.
Right.
So there's always a plan of action and milestones that people are used to. And normally that's a PDF document. Well, with our automation that we usually employ, it's not Rise 8, we use commercial technology from other providers, but there's a lot of modern options for this. But now you've digitized the plan of action and milestones. So now you can start checking in on people. If somebody said, hey, we're going to address that in Q2, now you can actually set a reminder and make sure the assessors go back and revisit that in Q2. And you can also do things like, usually like a new data connection will trigger a review, because obviously anytime you're introducing new data to the system, you want to assess the risk there. Well, now I can just automate. If the team adds a new API connection or reaches out to a new connection or opens new ports and protocols, I can trigger an assessment. So now my humans aren't just, constantly manually reviewing things. The system's helping focus their attention. And I think the more that you can do that, you can take what are very limited resources. I empathize with, as much as people bash on authorizing officials, my goodness, these people have thousands of systems assigned to them and like tens of staff.
Yeah.
They're constantly behind. And so the more you can help focus that attention, I think the better off you're going to be.
Yeah. Well, and that actually brings me to my next question. Do you see companies asking for this and getting told no? And if you say yes to the question, how does a company, I mean, we've kind of listed a lot of things here with best practice and different things. How does a company overcome the government saying, no, we don't even want to entertain this for you right now? How do they overcome that?
That's a tough one. Yes, I see people saying no. There are still plenty of programs, like the incentives in government aren't always great. As much as we would think what I just said is on the forefront of everybody's minds, that we can't afford to be disrupted on the battlefield and people die out there. Like, I saw missions fail because of bad software. This isn't a hypothetical future. Like, I actually saw people die because of bad software and missions fail because of bad software. I think the more that you can focus the attention on that and then enlist some of those end users, like assuming you can find those people and get in touch with them. That's actually hard in some programs, but you know, a lot of times if you're building software for an air operations center or a ground operations center, a JOC, find some of those users and get them to advocate on your behalf. I've heard crazy things. I've heard people say the warfighter doesn't want continuous software delivery because they would constantly have to retrain on the new software every time it released. Like you hear all these excuses,
Right.
but then you go talk to those people and they're like, yeah, we would love that.
Yeah.
Maybe with some limits, like maybe we don't want you to ship new software in the middle of our exercise.
Right.
The ability to do so is fantastic. And then we'll decide when to take it and when not to.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So we used to use a software for editing the podcast. I won't name them on here. They're very, 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 very popular. And the updates were coming so fast and furious that was one of the reasons we moved away from the software. We would literally have updates sometimes 3 to 5 times a week. And it would say, there's a new update, you need to update. Or we'd have 2 people using the software in the cloud. And all of a sudden it would say the one person was using the update, the one person wasn't. Now they couldn't communicate and it wouldn't do the update and they would have to deal with it. And it was one of those things where it was so frustrating. And a lot of times there would be an update and you're like, where's the feature that I use every single day in the business? And now it's gone or it's been moved or relocated, whatever. And so I can see the pushback from the users on too much updates or the updates that, wow, the company who makes this software thought this was really important, but it really ticked off all of the end users. I mean, there were features that they took away from us that they didn't have. And we're like, where did this go? It was super important. And now it's gone forever, without asking us, you know, and it's different in the government space where, you know, you can probably complain enough and get somebody to bring something back. I mean, me coming from a software background, I saw that happen where we either took something away or added something. I'm like, we don't like this anymore, make the change. And, you know, we would make the changes, but that's definitely a very interesting scenario to be in where there's too many updates happening and you're confusing the user or frustrating them, or now the software doesn't work. Or, you know, we've seen that over the years with Microsoft and a lot of big companies where they push an update now and everything's broken on every computer. I was just complaining to my partner, Josh, yesterday. I was like, do you have 2 monitors? He doesn't have 2 monitors. He only has 1. I have 2 monitors. And there's an update that happened to Windows 11 where my taskbar, I used to be able to put it on any monitor. And now you can't. It just all of a sudden it moved to the left monitor. I can't put it on the right. I always look to the right corner for my time. And now I'm confused, but it does have an option for all monitors or just the left monitor. And so I went to all monitors. So now I have it on both monitors, but it was one of those things. I'm like, why did they take away this ability to easily move this? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a fix for that, but it's little things like that annoy the user and either make them stop using the software or make them hesitant about it or confuse them, you know, and now their job is being done slower. And like you said, on the battlefield, that's where people die. Mm-hmm. And so it's really interesting to be in the development room and you're crafting all these solutions. But if you don't really understand what the warfighter is doing on the ground, that can cause a lot of problems for folks. So if you're a developer listening to this, please make sure you're talking to those end users so that you know what's important to them. You know, that's a big deal to me. It's always know, especially when it's, you know, somebody planning special forces missions or somebody planning rescue operations or whatever, like they really need to be connected to the development team on this. Yeah. So there's a little soapbox there, but that's just kind of my time in the Army and my time working with some of our clients, some things that were really important to me. So you mentioned a couple of different times where you would either lose revenue or add cost. And losing revenue was, let's take away 2 of our developers, FTEs, to give 2 assessors, or let's add 6 developers on this team to help with the implementation. Those are all pretty big costs for a small company. So for smaller contractors with limited resources, how do you recommend they approach this? Because it's a different animal when, man, that 1 FTE, that might be my difference between us making profit on this contract and not.
Yeah, definitely. There's a few things. I mean, one, again, if hopefully you can address these far enough left that it's just part of the total package. And the assessors aside, because those have to be independent. the automation team that I talked about, like hopefully that's something you can get for yourself. And if we're talking about a smaller project, you might not need that many, right? It generally scales pretty linearly. I think the conversation you have to have is the one of trade-offs, right? Because usually when I would propose this, let's just say there's a system that we're building and there's 3 capability components that roughly align to 3 development teams. Well, if I don't have a continuous ATO, that affects my velocity. So even though I have 3 teams worth of velocity, they're operating at a decreased velocity, significantly decreased. I'll just tell you, one of the programs where we've achieved continuous ATO, we have 8 applications that ship weekly. They could ship daily, but going back to your point, they don't necessarily want daily updates. And what we've done is we have always shippable code, right? So we choose to release on, I believe it's Wednesdays with them. They could say no if they were in the middle of an exercise, whatever, but like that's the capability that we bring. And that's to production, like to live operations at a secret or L5I level, right? So pretty stringent environment. Okay, if you take away that continuous ATO, we've mapped it out using like what traditional teams are able to achieve. We have about a 25x delivery speed to end users in terms of how many features not are developed but delivered. So even though you might be, let's just say we've only got 3 teams to work with, and I'm like, I want to take one of those teams and turn them into like a CATO, get my apps to prod team. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's 1/3 of our feature velocity. But it's like, no. If you look at it from an actual value delivered perspective, even though we're reducing the development team by 1/3, the actual feature development team, we're increasing value shipped by 10, 15x. That's the kind of levels that you can achieve when you can automate this ATO process the way that people do with continuous ATO. And so it's not going to help you if your contract is only a 1-team contract. Like when you're really small, the best thing you can do, I was really small once too, right? I only started 5 years ago. And the best thing you can do there is help them find people who have environments you can use. So one of my first customers, I actually helped them use Kessel Run's environment, which you can't do anymore. They actually don't take third-party customers. So sorry if you're listening and you're like, oh, let's go use Kessel Run. They probably won't accept you. Maybe not. I don't speak for them. But at the time, it was like, hey, they've got this great cloud environment. It has the ability to get a continuous ATO. Let's ship your app there. Not only does that get them speed and they don't have to pay for a bunch of teams, they didn't have to build their own platform. They didn't have to go through all the initial compliance for the underlying infrastructure. They were able to just use what existed. And then eventually, as their program grew, we migrated them to their own so that they could achieve some of the environments they needed, like Secret RHEL 5i, et cetera. So I think finding places you can start, like if you're on the Air Force side of the house, there's DoD Platform One. It's labeled DoD Platform One, but it's actually an Air Force program. There's like Palantir has this offering called FedStart. And my friends over at Second Front Systems have this program called Game Warden. Those are all options where there's an existing platform with an ATO that you can leverage to get your apps into production quickly. So I would use those shortcuts on smaller programs or as a smaller company. Once you start getting bigger, you can achieve the economies of scale where you can start having those trade-off discussions about like, yeah, even a 1/3 trade-off sounds bad, but when you look at it, value delivered goes through the roof.
Yeah. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I feel like in a topic like this, it is kind of an onion. We can just keep unraveling layers here all day long. As we close up, is there like 1 or 2 points you want to drive home for people that are looking at this?
Definitely. The value piece that I just mentioned. Like I was the warfighter at the other end of software delivery or non-delivery in most cases. You know, I mentioned I saw missions fail and people die. There was one pretty egregious incident that really drove me to go from intelligence to acquisitions. Like nobody does that, right? I had like the coolest job ever, and I went over to acquisitions. Sorry for the acquisitions people out there. I do love acquisitions now, but the reason that I did that is because we just weren't getting value delivered, right? And it's really easy to be a federal contractor, and you can make a ton of revenue, ton of profits even, and not actually deliver anything to warfighters. And, some of that's on the government. So like, I don't necessarily blame all the contractors out there, but at the end of the day, it might not be your fault, but it's your responsibility.
Mm.
Right? We have a responsibility to serve our men and women in uniform and really to serve our country indirectly. And I would say that, we talk about cost, schedule, performance and project management and all this stuff. On the other side of cost, schedule, and performance is value. It's a value equation, right? Value equals performance divided by cost times schedule, right? It's the amount of value you can deliver per unit of time per dollar. And so what you really need to focus on is increasing the amount of performance you can drive out per unit of time per dollar. And the most effective way, and I will debate anybody on this, the most effective way I've found to do that in this space, we can nerd out on like NIST RMF and ATOs, and it's easy to like rabbit hole into some really kind of like nerdy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what that's driving is this value equation where I can create huge amounts of performance, not just because my velocity goes up, but one thing we didn't talk as much about is the feedback loop with users.
Mm-hmm.
When I can start shipping software to production, now I'm not getting feedback on demos on a laptop. I'm getting feedback in operations environments with real data, maybe even on real missions or hypothetical, like training missions. So I'm getting more performance. Obviously, the time factor goes down in the denominator there. And the cost, if we just fix cost and focus on like a throughput model of software development, all right, we're increasing performance, the numerator, we're decreasing the time in the denominator, and we're fixing cost. The value equation just goes through the roof.
Yeah.
And so I found out that the software that I was using they had identified this issue 5 years prior.
Wow.
And a software developer, a contractor, had developed a fix for it. And the fix was sitting on the shelf waiting to go through the ATO process. So the thing that I saw cause mission failure and people die was sitting on the shelf with a fix waiting to go through the ATO process. So that's why it's imperative to fix this problem, whether you look at it from a value perspective or like a cost opportunity, a cost of delay. That cost of delay costs people their lives. Either way you look at it, this is a super important issue. As nerdy as it might seem on the outset, it's like we have to get this right. We have to figure out how to continuously deliver software.
Well, and that's, one of the saddest stories you'll hear where we had the fix the whole time, but we weren't allowed to implement it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of everyone's fault that we did it. And so, that's a really good example. Thank you for coming on and talking about this topic. Again, I know there's so many layers to this. We're probably scratching the surface for the most part on this topic. And, but it's good to at least start the conversation for a lot of folks, get them thinking, get them asking questions about this so that they can start to look at it as a way to not only grow their business, but to help the warfighter, which is ultimately like, for a lot of folks that are in government contracting, that is what this is about. It is about serving that community that we were once in and serving our brothers and sisters all over the world. And it's not just for the warfighter. There's a lot of other places that can use this, but the warfighter to me is the one that's near and dear to my heart. And it's the one that it matters the most to a lot of folks. So thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. And I'll look forward to maybe having you on again sometime.
Thanks.